Started. We've got a full room and I'm thrilled to say we've got 200 people signed up for this event online. So Professor Jiao, you bring a big crowd. So welcome everyone to today's Critical Issues Confronting China program. Thank you all for joining us today. The dramatic events of this past week in China certainly underscore how important it is for us to try to understand China on a personal level. What's in the minds of the Chinese people, in addition to knowing China from a policy level. And so today we're thrilled to have a very top Chinese scholar with us, Professor Jiaqing Guo from Peking University, to help us understand China's perspective on shifts in US-China policy, and perhaps even share some insights on the domestic situation as well. I'm Dinda Elliott, the Executive Director of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. Our mission is, as you know, is to support scholarship around China. And in the current increasingly anti-China environment here in the US, we believe more than ever in the importance of open dialogue, and it's crucial that we bring Chinese perspectives into our discussions. As you know, this series was founded by the late Professor Ezra Vogel, who believed deeply in intellectual exchange and people-to-people dialogue. And so inspired by that vision, we invite speakers from all corners to share their insights so we can look at China from all angles and perspectives. It's not easy for Chinese experts these days to come in person. And so we're especially grateful to Professor Jiao for joining us today. I also want to thank Bill Overholt, who I see sitting over there from the Harvard Kennedy School, for his help in organizing this series. I'd now like to introduce our moderator, Professor Michael Soni, who is the Frank Wenxiong Wu Professor of Chinese History at Harvard University. He's a social historian of late imperial and modern China who studies local society in Southeast China, and he is also deeply engaged in contemporary issues related to China. Professor Soni has participated in many Track 2 dialogues with Chinese scholars and is also an active member and leader of the Public Intellectuals Program at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. And most important to us today, Professor Soni served as the faculty director for the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies from 2016 to 2022. So we are very proud to truly claim him as one of our own. As always, following Professor Jiao's talk, he and Professor Soni will have a conversation and then open up to questions from the floor, and we will end at 1:15. So over to you, Professor Soni.
Thank you so much, Dinda. Dinda has already alluded to the, in many ways, disheartening context in which we find ourselves in the China studies community in the United States. And so in that context, it's particularly a pleasure to welcome a scholar who has a long history of crossing borders. He crosses borders in a number of ways. As a scholar, his academic career spans the US and China. He received his PhD from Cornell, spent most of his career at Peking University, where he is dean and current professor of the School of International Studies. But his academic career actually spans much more broadly than that. He's actually taught on 3 continents, having spent time at the University of Sydney, and if you include visiting professorships, on 4 continents. His career also spans the divide between academia and politics in ways that are both familiar to us in the United States and unusual. Like many of us, he has moved between the worlds of academia and think tanks. He spent multiple sessions at Brookings. He's also, in ways that are distinctively Chinese, crossed that boundary. He has been, since the 11th National Committee of the CPP, the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, a member of the Standing Committee. When academics in America, as you know, get old, they sometimes try to get involved in municipal politics. Professor Jia has also done that, but in a rather different way. He's vice chairman of the Beijing Municipal Committee, a bigger job than the sort of city councilman that some of us take on when we get old. Also, as Dinda mentioned, a significant figure in policy advising, senior researcher of the Hong Kong and Macau Research Institute under the NDRC, and a number of other policy advising roles over the course of his long career. His research foci are Chinese foreign policy, China-US relations, and cross-straits relations. We're lucky to have him here it's made possible because he's spending the current semester as a visiting scholar at the Freeman Spogli Institute for National Studies and the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford. So at this difficult moment, I'm particularly grateful that you're making the effort to spend time in the United States. I want to make just one quick advertisement before I hand things over to Professor Jia. He's not taking it easy while he's here because he will, in addition to many other speaking events, which I'm sure you can all find online, he will also be participating this Saturday night at the University Forum event. The University Forum, as many of you know, a program with which the Fairbanks Center is closely associated. Professor Jia will be commenting along with Liu Yawei on the remarks of another close colleague and friend, Professor Niu Jun, the title of Professor Niu's address, Recalling the Past to Understand the Future, 100 Years of Sino-US Relations. Probably the easiest way to attend that event is to go to the University Forum YouTube channel or to the Carter Center, where you can sign up for the mailing list there. So we'd be honored at any time to welcome a distinguished scholar and distinguished figure in Chinese political life, such as Jia Qingguo. We are especially honored and especially pleased to welcome him now in this context. So, Professor Jia, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
As you wish.
Yeah. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever. Good something. Well, thank you, Professor Sony, for your kind introduction. It's a great honor to be here again. This is not my first time, but to this great university and to this great center. And I'm particularly honored to be invited to come here to share some of my views about the topic we are supposed to address today. As Professor Sony mentioned, the relationship is not in a particularly good time. I think it takes a bit courage to host this event, and also for me to speak at this event, given the fact that there are a lot of people in both countries who are very critical of such kind of exchanges. Okay. It's unfortunate. I think such kind of exchanges are more than ever needed, as Linda just pointed out. I think our two great countries need such kind of interactions, and we need to talk to each other. We need to share our grievances about each other, as well as find ways to work together on interests of shared concern, issues of shared concerns, okay, and of course shared interests. Today's topic was suggested by Professor Mark Wu. That is how China will respond to the renewed liberal alliance. That's a very tough topic for me. But I think it's useful to talk about it because many people in both countries, especially in the US, want to know the answer. To address this question, I think the first thing we need to do is to clarify what we mean by the two key concepts in the question, that is the renewed liberal alliance and China's response. Okay. By renewed liberal alliance, I think it refers to the recent allegedly strengthened US-centered alliances of the Western countries, especially following the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war. Okay. We see efforts to work together more closely than before. By China's response, I think it refers to how Chinese government has reacted and will react to this development. Since Biden came into office, it has devoted a lot of efforts to renew and expand US military as well as political alliances with its partners. And it appears that some progress has been made, in part because of these efforts. We see a better coordinated NATO, stronger US-Japan alliance, and also efforts to strive for closer cooperation between US and South Korea, and US, Australia, New Zealand, ANZUS, and also the recent development with the Quad, US, Japan, India, and Australia. Of course, they're saying that this is much broader than something targeted at China, but China is one of their focuses, or probably the primary focus. In Biden's efforts to enhance and expand US military alliances, China has been both a tool and also a target for such kind of a purpose. As a tool, China has been used as a tool to unite people at home and also forging closer relations with allies overseas. When Biden came into office, he saw a dire need to rebuild American confidence in democracy, American faith in democracy, and the US allies' faith in US democracy. So this is a big challenge, he felt, because he and his people believe that such confidence or faith was seriously damaged by his predecessor. Whether out of conviction or out of political calculation, the administration talked about China as a threat to democracy and the need to unite to counter it. So China has become an instrument to rally the support both at home and overseas. Therefore, we find exaggeration of situation like in Hong Kong and also Xinjiang, call Xinjiang problem as a genocide. I think it's a gross exaggeration of the problem, but that's part of this process. And also there are efforts to shore up Taiwan's position in the light of the tension across the Taiwan Strait. And also efforts to demonize China's policies, ranging from freedom of navigation to Belt and Road Initiative. As China actually has been arguing that it stands by the principle of freedom of navigation, but then the US has basically portrayed China as a challenger to the freedom of navigation principle. I think the two countries basically agree that we should have freedom of navigation in the high seas. But the problem is they do have a difference in terms of conducting military and intelligence operations close in the high sea, close to another country's coast. China argues that you don't have the right to do that without prior consultation with the country. The US argues that, of course, we have the right because it's in the principle of, it's consistent with the principle of freedom of navigation in the high seas. So, but China does not oppose to freedom of navigation in the high seas in principle. It is only opposed to this kind of activities in the name of freedom of navigation. But nevertheless, this was portrayed in a very negative way by the US. Also, as a target, I think to Biden administration, China is not only a useful tool to rally domestic and international support, but also a country to be contained for various reasons. Okay. One reason is that China is a security threat. Many people in administration, they share the concern over the implications of the rise of China for the Western dominated international order. So they subscribe to the logic of Thucydides' trap. Okay? In other words, the rising power and the established power, their interests collide. Their relationship inevitably ends up in confrontation and war. As China rises, according to this argument, China would want to replace the US and take away the privileges of the US and try to dominate the world. So the US cannot tolerate this, and they have to confront and fight a war. This is and the struggle is a sort of zero-sum game, just like what Zhang Mearsheimer has been arguing all the time. Okay, and then there is also another reason that China should be a target. That is, China poses a threat to American way of life. For a long time, many liberals subscribe to the policy of engagement. They believe that this used to be the dominant group of US-China policy, defining US-China policy. They believe that engagement with China would encourage China to subscribe to US values and embrace liberalism and democracy. However, in recent years, they have found that China has been moving away from that direction. Okay? As China rises, they are increasingly worried that an economically, politically, and ideologically different China poses a threat to American way of life. So this is added reason to contain China. Therefore, to China and the the renewal of the so-called liberal alliances has much to do with competing, confronting, and containing China. And China has no alternative but to fight back. What has Chinese government done over in recent years? One is to stand firm on China's principles, especially to oppose international interference into its internal affairs, and also to defend China's territorial integrity. We can see this in China's rhetoric and actions on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and human rights. It can also be seen in China's rhetoric and actions on Taiwan. The second thing the Chinese government has been doing is to confronted with US efforts to label China as a sort of authoritarian state. China has argued that its political system is fundamentally a democratic one. As President Xi explained to President Biden, it is called the whole process democracy, meaning that it does not only include elections, but also continuous consultation, political consultation on important issues in policymaking. The third aspect of China's response is confronted with the perceived pro-independence provocations from Taiwan authorities and the US government. China has stepped up its efforts to enhance its own defense capabilities, both to deter Taiwan from independence and to deter the US from military intervention. So China has been spending a lot of money to make sure that Taiwan independence will not happen. In case of, we have the situation of Taiwan independence, the US intervention, military intervention will not happen. Okay. I think peaceful unification remains the most desirable option to Beijing, but the PLA has been ready to take the island over by force if the following red lines are crossed. The first is, actually these lines were drawn by President Yang Shangkun many years ago. The first is foreign military occupation of the island. The second is de jure independence by Taiwan. The third is development of Taiwan's effort to develop weapons of mass destruction. So these were specifically mentioned as red lines by former President Yang Shangkun many years ago. I think they are still the case as far as China's Taiwan policy is concerned. On human rights, China will continue to make efforts to protect and defend together with other countries, defend and protect human rights together with other countries. China will make efforts to improve its own human rights situation. That's in the white paper of the Chinese government. However, China will not tolerate international efforts to impose its own practice on China. And finally, China will continue with its efforts to develop good relations with all countries, including the United States, as long as they respect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, especially with, in this case, with developing countries. Having said this, I wish to argue that it is harmful to frame China-US relations simply in ideological terms. Okay, when we talk about China's response to renewed liberal alliances, I think the relationship is much more complicated than that. Okay. And it is both false and harmful to think that China-US relationship is just an ideological one. It is false because both countries share many values in common. Thus, in China's 24 character core values, we find such values as democracy, freedom, rule of law, and justice, values to which Americans attach a lot of importance. And these values are practiced very differently, in part due to different national conditions, as the Chinese government has been arguing for many, many times. Accordingly, as President Xi said to President Biden, China is not opposed to democracy. On the contrary, China has been seeking its best implementation. This is the Chinese government's view. It is harmful to conceive China-US relationship just in ideological terms, because if the relationship is reduced to value difference, then there is not much room for pragmatic management of the relationship. It is a fact that China and the US are stakeholders of the existing international order, whether you like it or not. It is also a fact that as superpowers, China is becoming one. The two countries can only protect their interests by maintaining the international order. But maintaining international order is such a costly business that no country can do it alone. As Professor Paul Kennedy suggested in his book, Rise and Fall of Great Powers. In history, great powers decline, not primarily because they were defeated by the rising powers, but by, they were they were weakened by the burden of maintaining order of the empire, or imperial order, now international order. So one way to get around this is to make good use of resources of other countries by working together with them to maintain the international order. And this is what the US has been doing for the better part of the post-war period. And this is what China probably will, or is trying to do and will do in the future. So the best strategy for China and the US is to leverage each other's resources to maintain the world order and to address various kinds of global challenges both countries are confronting with, instead of squandering their resources at confronting at each other. So this is something that both countries have to take it very seriously when they formulate policies toward each other. Well, we can compete, but we should compete to do better rather than to undermine each other. I think 2 years ago, maybe 2 years ago, I wrote a short essay arguing that with Biden coming into office, I hope we'll compete to do better rather than to, we will have benign competition rather than vicious competition. By benign competition, I mean competition to do better rather than to undermine the other side. We can also confront, but we should confront with each other's efforts to impose their wishes to oneself rather than whatever the other side does. So you have to be selective in terms of how or what you confront with. Finally, we must cooperate on issues where we and the international community have shared interests and stakes. So these should be the things that we should have in mind when we address the relationship between our two great countries. It is my hope that our two great countries will find ways to renormalize our relations in the best interest of our peoples and the international community for a better future of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jia, for those thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. I will just make a couple of quick, immediate reactions to give people in the audience a chance to come up with good questions. I find myself in broad agreement with your conclusions about the importance of avoiding, perceiving, and implementing the relationship between the two countries as an ideological competition. I'm somewhat surprised to find that you seem to be in broad agreement with Secretary Blinken. The last few minutes of your remarks seem to match very closely his comment that the relationship should be one of competing, cooperating where we can, confronting where we must, and competing where I've forgotten the exact formulation, but track very closely to your comments. And I wonder if you could say more about to the extent that your position represents the mainstream view within China, there seems remarkable congruence. That should be a good thing in goals and ideas about the structuring of the relationship. I'll just say a quick word about Taiwan. We have some extraordinary Taiwan experts in the room, so I'll leave substantive questions to them. But I found your remarks about Taiwan actually very reassuring in the sense that the possibility of any of those red lines being crossed is, I think, nil. or virtually nil. The Taiwan experts will correct me if I'm wrong. This suggests that the nature of the military buildup is perhaps more complex than simply a matter of avoiding these 3 red lines, because I'm quite sure that authorities in China are also aware that the possibility of any of these 3 red lines being crossed is effectively nil. The third comment I want to make has to do with your comments about the Biden administration's use of China as a tool to unite domestic and international opinion. Well, I must say you give a lot of credit to Joe Biden, because probably the one major issue, perhaps the only major issue on which there is broad bipartisan agreement in DC right now is China. And so I think that the perception of China that is coming to dominate the political elites in America, but also elsewhere, probably cannot persuasively be ascribed to Biden, but probably has something to do with China's own behavior. And so I would be interested to hear more on your thoughts about that alternative explanation for not unanimity, but a lot of uniformity in views among the liberal states of the world and the American domestic political community on China. And then finally, we had a senior member of the Biden administration here a couple of weeks ago, and they framed the overall Biden approach to the Indo-Pacific rather differently, as being, not surprisingly, as being aimed largely at providing reassurances to America's allies and friends that the US is not going away, that the US is not in a terminal decline, we had a wonderful conference organized by my colleagues at the Fairbanks Center a couple of weeks ago called Coexistence 2.0. Was that? Yep. And Jude Blanchette made a wonderful comment at that conference where he said, the US thinks, a lot of US opinion thinks that China is a terminally ill patient in the hospital. China thinks of itself as a bodybuilder, as a weightlifter with a cold. And the argument, of course, is that the US magnifies the internal problems of China, and China perhaps minimizes those. I think Jude's comment actually works equally well the other way. I think there's a broad sense in China that the US is on a hurtling downward slope. Certainly, there's plenty of evidence in support of that position, but Americans don't think that's true. And so I guess the question then, to frame this as a question, is whether in light of the Chinese perception, which I think you'll agree is broadly accurate, China has been surprised by the American success at reinvigorating its alliances, in particular since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. So I'll stop there. I've left you with a number of questions that you can reflect on and answer as you, or comment on as you will, and then we'll turn it to the floor for questions.
Okay, great. Well, these are very important and challenging questions and comments. Well, first of all, I think Secretary Blinken's description of the relationship with 3 components: competition, cooperation, and confrontation,
Confrontation, cooperation, and competition.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's true. It's not something wildly different from the reality. But I think the practice of the U.S. Policy on China is something different. They focus too much on competition and confrontation, too little on cooperation. Actually, we have so many shared interests on which we can cooperate, but the problem is the focus is on the on competition and confrontation. Okay. On Taiwan, I don't think China's policy has changed that much from the past, but its basis has been eroded by the efforts on the part of Taipei and also Washington. Okay. Now you have DPP, a party whose platform is to promote independence in power in Taipei. And so whatever it does, is viewed with great suspicion on part of Beijing. Okay, you have this party with the goal of Taiwan independence in power. The other on the other side, you have Washington, who has been trying to dishonor its commitments to China at the time of normalization of relations. Okay, we have U.S. made three commitments. One is to abolish diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The other is to withdraw forces, military personnel from Taiwan. The third is to abrogate security treaty with Taiwan. Now all these things are back. And Congress is playing a more active role in promoting the change. So the political basis for diplomatic relations between the two countries is seriously eroded. Okay. And China had an implicit commitment. Okay. That is, we will strive our best to achieve unification by peaceful means. Okay. But of course, China has never given up the use of force in case of Taiwan independence. Okay. So with the changes in Taipei and also changes in Washington, Beijing is under tremendous pressure to change its policy on Taiwan and also on China-US relations. If the political bases are gone for China-US relationship, I think the diplomatic relations between our two countries are under threat. Okay. So I wouldn't be surprised if the current trend continues, that we will see a downgrade and even abolition of diplomatic relations between our two countries in the worst case scenario. And also resumption of military hostilities in the Taiwan Strait. Because if the bargain, your share of the bargain is not taken seriously, why should we take seriously our share of the bargain? That's the logic. So the Taiwan issue is tricky at the moment. We have to think very carefully about what we should do. China, well, too much credit to the Biden administration to use China as a tool to unite the US and also the world. Well, I think the administration has been trying to take advantage of this anti-China kind of a situation. So instead of taking pragmatic measures on China-US relations, the administration opted to take the easy way, that is to go along and use China as the rally call for unity, both at home and overseas. It's very complicated because the Biden administration also wanted to do something at home, okay, like rescuing the economy and fight against the pandemic at the time. So it needed to pass major legislations, but Congress was very anti-China, and the Democrats' advantage was so slim that Biden administration had to be tough on China in order to get things done. Okay, so that's the political aspect, or domestic politics aspect of the situation. So China has been used as a tool in that sense. So Biden goes along despite the fact that they may not agree with a lot of policies imposed by the Trump administration. And also, China, the U.S., U.S. policy toward China, U.S. efforts to assure its allies is not going away. But that's a reaction to Trump's, the policy, or implications of the Trump's policy. Trump was a unilateralist. U.S. allies anywhere in the world was very much worried about U.S. becoming isolationist. But the way to assure the U.S. allies in the Asia-Pacific region has been construed as the necessity to confront with China. So that's a twist. It's not a. You can use other excuses to rally your friends, but then they chose to use China because that's the easiest ways to do it. It seems to me. Okay. Well, the deterioration of China-U.S. relations. Of course, China has its own share to blame. China has not been able to tell its own story more effectively. Mm-hmm. For example, the Hong Kong issue. I watched the whole thing. I spent hours and hours in front of the TV to watch the development. The Hong Kong police probably is the world's best professional, the most professional police in the world. Yeah. Confronted with such large scale and often sporadic violent demonstrations, no one was killed in the confrontation. That was something very, very, special. But this story has never been fully told here. All you get is violent suppression of demonstrations. Okay, think about January the 6th demonstrations. It was equally violent in a certain sense. But then here, the efforts to restore order is conceived as efforts to restore order. But in Hong Kong, it's effort to suppress democracy. So you have very different standards in terms of how to address but China has a problem of telling its own story well and get it across to American people and to people of other countries. This goes from one issue to another. All we hear from the media is bad news about China, but China has also made a lot of progress in other aspects, in some aspects. For example, the anti-poverty campaign. I mean, this is a time for the world to pay attention to this issue now. The world has become more and more unequal. And polarization is plaguing the world. We have terrorism, we have hopelessness on the part of a lot of the poor, and it's time for us to pay attention to this. And it's good. It's that China is paying attention to this, and then we spend a lot of resources on the anti-poverty campaign. I don't agree with a lot of efforts, a lot of measures taken. I think they were very inefficient and wasteful. But I do believe that it's time for us to pay the attention to the distribution problem. And another thing is the climate, environment issue. 10 years ago, Beijing's air was seriously polluted. Everybody was worried about the PM 2.5. It's the same case in all major cities in China. Now, after many years of effort, the strong, tough efforts to address this problem, the situation has improved tremendously. And there are other things that China, has failed to convey to the world, that the progress China has made over the past decades. I think it's unfortunate. I think if China has been more successful in this regard, the world would have a more balanced view of China. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Professor Jia, for clarifying, responding to my many questions. I actually want to follow up on virtually all of them, but I don't actually think that's appropriate here, so I won't, because I want to have time for questions. I think I will just say two quick comments, which I think you're absolutely right. China has not done a good job at telling its own story. That's something to think about. I also feel like I have to say that your really alarming comments about the possible direction of US-China relations over Taiwan, the downgrading, the abolition of relations, that is indeed a very bad case, but it's not the worst case.
No,
the worst case is far worse. Is far worse than that. Okay, we're open for questions. Please put up your hand, and I will recognize you if we have some questions online. But I'll start keeping a list. But we'll bring questions online in as well. As always in this forum, identify yourself very briefly if you wish, but the point is to ask a question. And judging by the ages here, I think we do have some students in the room. I'd be very anxious to hear, or very keen to hear from a couple of students. I've got you, Bob, you had your hand up and the mic is right there. So let's start with Bob.
I think you're right that much of the reaction in the United States is kind of belief that the rise of China represents a threat to America. And in that context, you get your message across in America how well you're doing, or thinking about China is dominated by the rise of China. Having said that, China has made great strides and great success in using its power to rise. We've seen major accomplishments in security around its periphery and Asia. So compared to 10 years ago, almost every country on China's periphery is now trying to navigate West and relations rather than simply aligning with America and doing what America wishes. So that we are, in effect, seeing the erosion of American security partnership, whether it's Philippines, whether it's South Korea, Singapore, and other countries as well. And at the same time, we're seeing the Chinese become a far more capable competitor of the United States without China Sea. In these circumstances, do you see anything America is doing that is surprising? Anything that you would not expect America to be doing? And then second, given America's response, how confident are you that China can continue to be?
Well, that's a great question. It depends on how you look at things. I think things can be interpreted in very different ways. If you view China as a stakeholder, then you will think that China is a country that you can cooperate and try to make good use of. It's the resources to help you to maintain international order. Remember, Bob Zoellick called China a stakeholder. As a stakeholder, you share a lot of interests. So you can make good use of the enhanced capability of China to do greater things together. But then there's also another way to look at China. That is China as a challenger, revisionist country. And that's probably what a lot of people tend to believe now. So they believe that as China rises, China would challenge the existing international arrangements and challenge the US, the dominance, and then we have a conflict. But I think the problem with this view is that we are destined in conflicts. And it's not true that China and the US want to destroy the order in which they benefit. They benefit most, more than any other country. So it's very important how we look at each other. I think we should take a realistic view of each other rather than ideological or simplistic perspective about of each other, just as a challenger. We are not challenged. Well, the U.S. is probably it's in the U.S. best interest of the U.S. to work and make good use of China's resources, and it's in China's interest, both as a country, in ordinary country, and also a superpower, to make good use of U.S. resources to help maintain the international order, in which both countries can benefit tremendously if we can do that. Thank you.
Lucy.
Thank you very much. My name is Lucy Ruby. I'm now a visiting scholar here, but I worked for many years in China with financial service, but no more. My question is about a story that I think a lot of us would like to hear more of from China, and that is the nature of China's relation with Russia these days. I wondered if you could comment more on that. Maybe you could elaborate on when China and Russia became closer, and was that a symptom of a deteriorating relationship with the US, or did it predate? And whether some American analysts are correct when they see China and Russia as having a new and secret alliance. Thanks very much.
Thank you. China-Russia relations. I think for many years, the two countries tried to develop closer relationship with each other because both felt the pressure from the US. So that's a way to alleviate pressures of the US from the US. Basically, they are sending the message that if you push us too much, we will become allies. But in more recent years, the situation took a different turn. Of course, the old rationale continued to exist, but then the two countries have developed their more stakes in the relationship with each other. So now we have cooperation on a whole range of issues. Both in the old days, it's more political. Now it's both political, economic, and also even military relationship. So the relationship has never been better after the 60s or since the 60s. But there is limit to the relationship. That is, I think the limit is the perceived core national interests of the two countries. Russia would not go all the way to help China if China challenged its core national interests. We can see that in their cooperation over the years. Russia is very careful, very cautious about whatever efforts that can be construed as undermining its sphere of influence. And also, as far as China is concerned, China also has its own limit. China would not risk a war or confrontation with other countries for Russia's sake. And China has its own principles. China has never fully endorsed Russia's effort to take over Crimea and the recent Ukraine war. Why? Because China does not believe, and China is opposed to any country who tries to, China does not believe any country has the right to promote independence of a piece of territory of another country through some kind of plebiscite among the residents over that piece of territory. China does not believe that this is the right way to do it, because this is related to China's interests on Taiwan. China has never fully endorsed. China has never endorsed actually Russia's behavior on the Crimea and also on Ukraine. It's not just a question of Western. It would have a made a relationship between China and the West more confrontational. It's also a matter of principle for China. But China is sympathetic with Russia because Russia has Russia's experience in modern times has been a tragic one. Crimea used to belong to Russia in modern history, and also the Ukraine issue, again, that's a part of the very recent history. So Russia has some, justifiable grievances, but China does not believe that use of force is the right way to address such kind of grievances. Will China and Russia develop a closer alliance against the West? I don't know. It depends. Depends on the change in the world situation. Thank you.
Okay, we'll go next to the gentleman in the back. I have Steve and then Bill, and then we'll go, if there are no other questions, question there, and then we'll go to questions online.
Good afternoon. And you started this talk about the United States and China's shared commitment to the freedom of navigation and China and other countries' discomfort with the US doing these close to shore freedom of navigation missions. I was wondering, given that, what within China is the purpose of building up facilities in the South China Sea and some is adding the soil to physically increase the size of some islands?
Well, thank you. China has claimed the rocks and islands and also maritime interests associated with those rocks and islands for many years, since the 70s, since the 40s. We have this so-called 11 dash line, and later on it became 9 dash line after Sino-Vietnamese a border treaty, a border agreement. But in the old days, China was weak. The Chinese people, talk to the Chinese government. You have to do something about it. The Chinese government said, we are too weak. We cannot do anything about it. We cannot do too much about it. But China has never given up its claims over the years. But then China has become not so weak after a period of rapid development. And then people are talking to the Chinese government. We're not that weak. Why don't you do something? Other countries are doing things in the South China Sea, like Vietnam, Philippines, and others. They are building, they are constructing on the rocks. So I think this is the background. And then major decision was made that we should take more measures to defend China's so-called territorial interests. Okay. I think, China has done this not by driving other countries' forces from the disputed islands. Rather, it's building on its own claim. It's the islands and rocks under its control. Okay. So from the Chinese perspective, there is nothing illegitimate. There is nothing wrong with it. But then the US has been seeing this as a big threat they say it's a violation of international law. And so we have a dispute there. We have a dispute with our neighbors, and our neighbors have dispute between themselves. So we need some kind of effort to negotiate some kind of agreement to address this issue. We had in the past we had this declaration basically urging all countries to exercise restraint and then waiting to see a peaceful resolution of the disputes. And more recent years, they are negotiating a code of conduct. The Chinese government has been advocating that we should have a code of conduct over the South China Sea. But so far, for all kinds of complicated reasons, we haven't reached an agreement. There was some kind of optimism a couple of years ago, but now it seems to be to me that it's still quite far away. The agreement. I hope that I think it's in the best interest of all countries that we have this this code of conduct, and then we can at least avoid to let this conflict to affect our relationship, to affect our broader interests too much.
To Yang Cheng-kun's guardrails. What you didn't mention was the anti-secession law. And the anti-secession law, as the Chinese tell us constantly, is the legal constraint for China on dealing with Taiwan. And there is a part of the anti-secession law that identifies the exhaustion of all attempts at independence. Could also be a pretense or a pretext for China.
All attempts at reunification,
But yes.
not independence.
Right.
You said the exhaustion of all attempts at Taiwanese independence.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You meant reunification.
Yes,
Sorry.
yes. All attempts at unification are exhausted. And I think one of the things that concerns us, the people who deal with Taiwan, is that when we talk to Chinese about what's going on in Taiwan, it's considerable misunderstanding. And so when you have a subjective element in the anti-secession law, which is simply saying some leader or some political body someday will judge that attempts are exhausted, and you have a misunderstanding of what's going on in Taiwan, you've got a very volatile situation. And that's what concerns us. The guardrails are not that clear.
Yeah.
Secondly, on the abrogation of the defense treaty with Taiwan, we didn't abrogate it. The United States allowed it to expire within a year, and we replaced it with the Taiwan Security Act.
Really?
And the Taiwan Security Act, which the Chinese knew, was a pledge of a continued defense relationship with Taiwan. So that was there from the beginning. We differ over the nature of the defense relationship, how much can be sold, how much can't be. But that was no surprise to the Chinese that there would be a continued defense relationship.
Maybe I'll get you to hold off. We've got
Okay.
about 5 minutes left, and there wasn't really a question there.
No, I know.
Which is forgivable. But maybe we'll take the last two questions from the floor, one from Bill quickly and one from the gentleman in the back quickly, and then allow you to sum up against all three. And I apologize to those of our guests online whose questions won't be asked.
Well, thank you very much for a very balanced, thoughtful talk. I accept almost 100% of your characterization of US policy. I'd like to get your reaction to a characterization of Chinese policies, which is that China was poor and victim early on, but there comes a time when there's a transition. And I guess I'd use the Chinese fishing fleet as an example of the transition. Initially, it was poor, subsidies were appropriate. It was full of starved North Korean fishermen flowed over to Japan because of Chinese illegal fishing off North Korea. And when the South Korean Coast Guard tried to stop illegal fishing, these militarized Chinese fishermen killed the Coast Guards. And up and down the coast of India, the coast of Africa, people are starving because of exploitative Chinese fishing. And so China's gone from poor victim to rapacious of power in many aspects. I include the South China Sea. Scarborough Shoal was first big conflict. It was recognized internationally in the 1930s.
We're going to have to give Professor Zhao a chance to respond. Let's turn into a question.
But grabbing too much.
Just quickly shout out your question and make it quick, please.
The talks to renew liberal order. It seems like for many years, China's economic strength was its best tool responding to liberal order. You could tempt Europe always with, issues of trade. And for the first time in my short lifetime, it seems like trade and economic growth are no longer being made secondary to issues of national security, disease prevention. So I wonder whether you agree with that assessment that trade and economic growth are sort of no longer the priorities they once were, and how that affects transitionally to respond to a worldwide question for US-Europe relation?
Great. So China's role in the world, Taiwan, and the global international economic order, 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll be very fast.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I think on the Taiwan issue, I think anti-secession law should be given more attention. Basically, if you follow the anti-secession law, Taiwan mainland relationship, the current relationship is a one country, two system arrangement, even though it's a de facto one country, two system arrangement. If that's the case, then the use of force to address that problem is not necessary unless we see the changes, the 3 changes that mentioned by Yang Shangkun. Second, on the question of China as a victim, I think we're reflecting on the victim mentality part of the among the Chinese. Probably it's time for us to go beyond that. Actually, President Xi Jinping last year talked about looking at the world 平视 in a horizontal way rather than in a way that you look up. Actually, you need to look at the world in a horizontal way. In other words, you are equals. But of course, China has developed so fast that China's mentality has not changed accordingly. So a lot of people are still used to look at the world from a position of weakness and also victim, and that's not very helpful. And probably China should change accordingly. This involves a lot of policies, how to develop, redevelop our relationship on the quality of equality, on the basis of equality and mutual reciprocity. And finally, I think the best way for China to respond to the so-called liberal challenge is to do a better job itself, to make China a more open, free, and prosperous society, more equitable with more equitable distribution. Let all people enjoy the fruits of policy of reforms and openness. If China can do that, I think China can make a great contribution to the world's humankind's search for a better society. Thank you.
That is, of course, also the best policy for America to respond to developments in China. We're a little bit over time, so we'll have to stop here. Professor Jia, thank you so much for your very careful and thoughtful remarks. I think we probably have disagreements on some of the issues, but to invoke the name of the founder of this series, Ezra Vogel, Ezra would say the important thing is that we are still talking, that there is a value to that even through our disagreements. And so I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us today in support of that view of the world and of the role of academics in it. Thank you all very much.
Cheers.